So today with us, we have Olaf and Olaf Hartong. And from Jordan and I working with purple teams and building an entire platform for purple teaming, we have had to do a lot of research that fortunately Olaf has already put together for us and made way easier. So that has been so helpful for us, incredibly helpful. And Olaf, I probably am not going to do you justice in trying to introduce you because, I mean, it's awesome and MVP, right? So that's a huge accomplishment. And I think from adversarial detection, everything you've done in the industry has been amazing and has just driven us so much further in actually trying to create a platform that organizations can secure their environments, and it's incredible. So, not drilling, but I am going to get you.
It's humbling, though.
Duh, yeah. So interesting. So I guess from your perspective, I was going to ask a couple questions real quick. Like, how'd you end up here? I mean, it's been a lot of effort to get here, but what got you into InfoSec and brought you this direction?
Oh, the InfoSec, that will take too long. But how I got sharing, I guess, is I started watching so many of the recordings of online cons or the regular ones. And there were so many people that I look up to, like Dave Kennedy that you had yesterday, but also John Strand. There's so many people sharing so much valuable information. And I learned so much from that I just started dabbling with things and put everything out there that I thought that people might be finding useful. And this is how I got here, right? So I just forced myself eventually to get up on stage because I was downright petrified. It was so scary. It felt so scary. I'm actually quite, what do you call it? It's a shy person probably. And I actually learned by going to all these conferences, talking to people, that a lot of people feel like me, like an imposter, whatever, I shouldn't be here. But the feedback you get and the people you get to meet and all the things you learn from interacting with all those people is so valuable that I actually started to like it. And I still get very scared of doing this stuff, even though it is a lot easier, right? I'm just looking at my screen, there's a camera there, but you hardly notice it. So, but I still, I'd prefer to be on stage, just to meet the people afterwards and actually see if I make a stupid joke that they laugh about it or not, which is even more awkward. But then at least you have that expression there, right? And now I have to assume it, or at least can hear you. But that's it. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's probably how I got in there. And I still put a lot of stuff out there. Some of it might not be useful to only, or might be only useful to only 2 people, but that's already a win. If they don't have to do the stuff I already did and take it away, that's basically my biggest goal.
That's so awesome. Yeah. Okay, so stupid jokes. I'll have to lead us on a dad joke then. I have a joke about a cat. Do you want to hear it?
Sure.
I'm just kidding. That's all. That leads us right up to the top of the hour. Olaf, a year ago, and I apologize about the odd introduction, but have at it, sir. I'll be hanging out with you. If for some reason you get disconnected, they'll just see my face instead. It's going to be awesome. Go for it, man.
Yeah, I have to worry though. My PowerPoint crashed a couple of times already, so I might switch to VM in the middle of the talk if it has to. But other than that, thanks for that very humbling introduction. I'll kick it off. So the title is Resilient Detection Engineering. What did the bear do in the woods? It's a weird title, I know. I'll explain it later. A little bit about myself. I'm a defensive specialist and a co-founder of Falcon Force. It's a relatively small company of 8 guys, and with the same intention as we were discussing prior to the talk starting, we want to make the world a little bit better by putting as much as we can out there and helping a lot of companies get more resilient, at least against attackers. And also from that note, I'm primarily a threat hunter. I do some IR or compromise assessments, and in general, it's mostly detection engineering, what this talk is also about. And to refer to Ken's prior talk, I used to be a documentary photographer, so I had a sort of alternative road into InfoSec. And of course, I like warm hugs because, yeah, thanks for Disney, everybody knows me. I do put some content out there. You can look it up on GitHub if you aren't aware of my work. I do a lot of Sysmon things. I have some Splunk apps and some other tools that I'm working on. So this title, right? When I filed the CFP, I thought it would be fun to talk about some Russian attackers, especially with the elections coming up. So there's the APT-29 and 28, the Bears and the Dukes, and I wanted to do some research. So I went to my trusted source, the Urban Dictionary, and I've basically poked in Duke, and this was sort of interesting. Do the right noble thing. Well, it doesn't really apply there. So it's also slang for parents. And then there's also this thing where it got a little bit distracting for me. So I kind of moved on to the bears. So the bear is commonly known as a hairy, cuddly guy. So, okay, maybe not. Fussy woodland creature. Okay, yeah, I get that. And then it's the greatest threat to America, apparently, according to Stephen Colbert. So it's no, I figured, no, this is weird. I shouldn't be going there. And in the end, the actor is in a way irrelevant to the subject at hand. Primarily want to convey the bigger message. So detection, it's quite difficult, as you heard Kent also say. There's so much things to focus on. Man, you probably felt the same as I did a couple of times, like Elliot in the picture, where you were hoping to catch them, and you actually ended up in a really, really long IR situation. And if you weren't there, be glad, because, yeah, I don't know. It's not fun always. It's interesting, but you get to learn a lot at least. So often you do find where you get either a report, or you are lucky enough to have a red team internally, or go to a purple team, and they expose a lot of gaps in your detections. Or you also learn that whenever you use a SIM, that the stock content that was provided proved less valuable. It missed a lot, or it was so noisy that you turned it off. And you might have an EDR running, and you assumed that it would catch everything because that was what the marketing told you, right? But apparently there were quite a lot of ways to circumvent that. And a lot of the rules that you actually had also proved to be easily bypassable, which is a common mistake that I see organizations make. And I did a lot myself, to be honest. So I started working on a sort of procedure to work on proper solid detections and also keep them up to date and test it, which I call the detection engineering cycle. And it's been referred to a lot of times by other people as well. It's not my concept. I learned from a lot of people in the industry, and this is my way, or my interpretation of it. So first you start with an hypothesis, and this is also what was referred to in the keynote this morning by Hacks for Pancakes. Sorry, I forgot your real name. And from there on out, you start gathering a little bit of focus. Where should I start my detections? Where should I focus? And attack, of course, is one of the great resources that we all are using and referring to, and sometimes trusting a little bit too much, which I will get back to on. And then from there on out, you have a selected technique that you want to be covering. So you start investigating, find ways on how this can be executed, probably do some pre-assessment on the data you'll need, and also start working on how does it work, what does it look like, what can I derive from this, what can I learn from this, these kind of things. And from there, you start building a detection analytic and start wide, and then you start refining on multiple iterations to find out, okay, what can I leave out, what do I need, and where should I be focusing my efforts. And maybe you start learning that you can't do it with one, you need more. And then from there on out, you start analyzing it also in your production environment. You start reviewing the results, enrich where possible with a CMDB. God have you if you have that. Hopefully you're that lucky. And then start tuning your content to also keep it resilient in the way that you do exempt your admins in certain ways, but you do still get all the stuff you really want to catch. And next to that, you would preferably also start implementing validation scripts in a tool that you would have. And then in the last phase, you basically report, you measure the efficiency, you measure the scope, and also the efficiency of the detection itself next to the validation scripts. And from there on out, you can rephrase your hypothesis and move on. So this is in a really brief nutshell the process, which I will come back to in the future slides as well. And in the end, it of course all starts with data. And as we're all aware, there's tons of data to be gathered. The graph that you see is basically a visual representation of the data sources that MITRE references in all their techniques, and the bigger pile is a data source that you could be utilizing. And the big spike, you can't read it, of course, is process monitoring, which you can do on all these OSs. And there, on the OS itself, there are so many variants of getting logs. So of course, Sysmon and the event logs on Windows are super valuable. But even in there are quite some distinctions of stuff that you might not want to ingest. And this is also to the point where you shouldn't be hoarding all the data. In an incident, it might be nice, but it also might clog up all your pipelines, your systems. And it might distract you from actually building a solid detection. So you always need to strike a balance somewhere there. And one of the bigger mentions or notes that I learned a couple of years ago from John Lambert is this a really nice phrase where he mentioned defenders think in lists. I mean, everybody uses Excel, tables, and all the other things. And attackers often work with graphs. And as long as this is true, attackers will win. And I showed you a couple of lists already. I will show you more, but I also want to emphasize that this doesn't make this statement any relevant. So next to lists, there are a lot of visual ways to also investigate. And I'll show you a few, but a lot of people already did with all kinds of amazing Jupyter notebooks and graphs and other ways of visualizing it. So from my personal perspective, I digest data a lot easier in a visual manner than looking only at piles of rows and text. So find a balance for yourself. So should you start from scratch when building some detections? Well, not necessarily. The generic stock content that SIEM providers often provide you right off the bat when you install it isn't useless. The thing is that it does need a lot of tuning, right? So you always need to fine tune it to your environment, and maybe you'll encounter that some of it is actually not what you're looking for. So disable that. And then on the open source end, there's so much data. There's probably slides full that you could be sharing. So of course there's the Sigma project, which I'll refer to a little bit later again as well. MITRE puts out a cyber analytic repository. A couple of vendors do also a lot of open source sharing. So Elastic, Splunk, Microsoft, they all do it. We do it. We have our Falcon Friday where we do on a weekly basis share at least some Defender, ATP, or sometimes Sentinel or Sysmon queries. Samir, my former colleague, is putting out a lot of log samples of attacks that he researched. And these are all great sources to start from. So definitely you shouldn't always have to start from scratch. However, it might be useful to do that in parallel, and I'll show you why later. And this is, of course, one of the biggest known pictures or the best known pictures in the infrastructure industry, where David Bianco introduced the pyramid of pain, and especially the bottom part for the scope of detection engineering, that's a no-go. I mean, this is stuff that you can automate, so there's no point in focusing there. But the top part, though, is where the interesting parts are, where you can actually build a lot of behavioral-based and even signature-based detections. Because this is simply where the most advanced attackers will be, and also where you will get the most value from your efforts, since the other stuff is so easily to change. So there is this big distinction. Sorry for the extreme graphic, but it stands to a point, right? So the signatures are fairly static, almost IOC-like rules, with probably some ways of trivially bypassing it. And even though I didn't see Dave Kennedy's talk yesterday, I know that he is really up on the soapbox on this, and rightfully so in most cases, because if you rely on only signature-based detections, then it's, as he often demonstrates, super easy to bypass, where behavior-based rules are a lot harder to bypass, but they also do take a little bit more effort to build, and it's not always possible, I have to say that. But once you combine multiple elements and correlate these events, then you have a lot more solid ways of building detections that are actually resilient against evasion tactics. So resilient detection should actually only focus on IOCs whenever the changing of the behavior is very hard. So for instance, in a DC-sync attack, it's actually quite difficult to change, or it's probably even impossible to change the global unique IDs that you can be monitoring to see whether a DC-sync attack is going on. So then a signature-based detection is actually quite valid. However, they also, in general, should resist evasion techniques. So they have a certain means of flexibility. And of course, this will give you some false positives. So you need to strike a balance. But preferably, they do focus on the behavior and not as much on a sole indicator where you should be and not focusing, basically. Sorry, I got distracted. And through this means you actually are able to identify new methodologies or evasions that you might otherwise not have catched in this way. So they actually, in a way, are more proactive than reactive. And it's more active than reactive. It depends on how your assumption is. But there is a bunch of things that you have to consider if you start building these kinds of detections, because up front, when you start, you already start with a sort of bias or assumption where you expect data to be seen, but also make sure that you validate your assumptions or actually try to prove them wrong. Sometimes you learn the most there, where you actually encounter that you could have seen it in multiple different ways, where you only expected it to be looked and looked only in one place. So always go broad. You may need some specific rules to capture edge cases, which, as you mentioned before in the signature example. And actually, every time you build a set of detections, try to actively bypass them and validate them over time. So have a way in your process of developing it to store the things you did that allow you to repeat that step, even in a production area. So as I mentioned before, the false positive rate is also very important here. And this is often your biggest kill your darling moment, where you have the perfect detection, but it's either too narrow or it's too noisy, where you get too many false positives and the SOC will be mad at you. And as I mentioned, the internet-based detections, so the examples from a lot of public repositories, they're actually really good. But you really need to make sure that they cover what you expect them to cover, and just don't enable them and trust that the researcher did the same scrutiny as you did. So once you start doing some research, you should look at all the known ways that you can find to use it in a malicious way. There's so many resources out there that describe a lot of tools that you can quite easily get and start replaying in your lab environment, which should be always a very verbose environment. So put most of the things to max. It doesn't matter. It's only a small lab most often cases. So then at least shows you all the possibilities that you could be utilizing to capture something. And if you then later on choose that something in production is way too costly, too risky, or not worth the effort of going through the whole change process to enable it, that's fine. But then at least you know what the alternatives are, and you can make a sort of well-informed decision there. And once you start utilizing all these tools, document all the commands that you can find, or everything that you know that you can repeat, or that you might that might inspire you to do something else with it. Definitely utilize those. So from that perspective, also start reading the documentation, at least for once, right? Nobody does this. We're all hackers. Everybody likes to play, but at least understand from the creator of the tool whether it's malicious or not, and whether it's available or not does make sense, of course. But at least what the original way of using the tool, the intentions of the tool actually were. So what parameters can you use? What are they doing? What is the syntax? What can you change there? And compare this with your notes which you found, and see if there are sort of discrepancies, or the overlaps are of course obvious, but there might be some nice ways that actually teach you to do something in a different way as well. And replay all these options in your lab, look at the outcomes. So see what you can actually utilize from there. And in terms of the let's say you start with an internet query, then or a query that you already had. If you're in the second cycle, always validate your initial detections in a way, also with the new techniques that you found. So sometimes it failed on one of the variants, and you can improve it by either just rewriting it, making it less specific. If you find a way to make or not also make a lot of extra false positives, but you can also split it up into multiple smaller detections, where you start layering them and make a correlation rule that only fires on the triggers that you actually want to have from the other ones, or a certain threshold if it goes over a certain level. So the important thing here is balance. So you shouldn't throw up walls and be only true positive, which is impossible. But you also shouldn't be like the right situation where most of it gets passed. So this also means sometimes accepting something that is actually more a signature than a behavior-based rule. But if you start layering multiple signatures, you might end up with a correlated behavior, which is still fine. So perfect is still your enemy. Don't lose too much time in building the single best technique, because there's so much ground to cover. You have to do a ton of other ones. So 80-20 is already great. If you get to 80% of covering a technique, you're so much further than most of the people around you. So be glad with that. And this is a nice simple diagram that Jared Atkinson wrote about a while ago in a blog, and he called it the detection spectrum. But this is actually spot on what I was trying to convey as well. Where on the left side you have very, very precise analytics that have a very low false positive ratio, but you also tend to miss a lot. And on the ultimate right side, there are very, very broad, almost hunting-like rules, where you do get high false positive, but you at least catch everything. And then you need to find the balance for your organization, for your environment, but also for your security appetite. If you have a really large team, then probably build a sort of preciser ones on the left end where it gets alerts and you focus with your hunting team, or you're correlating in a way that is actually useful to you to cover the rest of the spectrum, because you probably need to do both anyway. So let's say you have a threat intel team, then they probably consume most of these feeds that I showed here, and also a ton of other ones. But I don't. Well, I do, but not every client does, and not all clients that I work for do. So I listen to probably 5 times as much podcasts that are here. So with the whole COVID situation, it struggles a little bit. But I used to be quite a lot in the car, or on a plane, so I got to get through all of them quite easily. Now I have to dedicate my time a little bit easier, or focus a little bit more. And I read a lot of blogs. I use Feedly for that, and people can reach out to me later on if they want to have my Feedly set. I'm more than happy to share it with all the blogs that I gathered over the years. And then, of course, Twitter is one of my primary data sources as well. And of course, conferences like this have so many great speakers that also provide really good intel. And maybe often overlooked one is also your SOC. They battle with a lot of things. They find stuff. They have suspicions what's going on. So they also might be able to point you into directions where they feel open or exposed. So definitely utilize those as well. But from a sort of simple example, I was on Twitter, and my friend Otvar tweeted about his amazing project, the LOLBAS project, where all living off the land binaries and scripts are being curated, so to say. And he published some details about the most visited pages within this very vast repository. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these are the most used by attackers, but at least they are the most referenced in a way. So it could also be that the whole detection world is actually focusing on these, and attackers are doing something completely different. But for argument's sake, that doesn't really matter. It's just an example that I want to use to work through a process. So what I then started doing is I queried attack for these 9 tools that were mentioned, and all the techniques that are mapped to them. And all these graphics that you'll see very much look like Bloodhound, and it actually is. I created a fork. I shoehorned attack into it with some help from the set processor. And I added some pretty looking icons and some other query stuff, just to make it a little bit easier for me to go through this data set. So a couple of lessons that we can immediately learn from loading 9 tools into seeing whether attack references them is basically only 3 out of the 9 tools are visible, right? It's search util, bits admin, and command. So the other 6 are maybe somewhere in there, but they're at least not referenced as a tool or a piece of software directly tied to some adversary behavior. But also, you can use one tool to execute several techniques, where you can use search util to do install root certificate, you can ingress a tool transfer, and you can do deobfuscation of files and commands or information. Yeah. And also the other way around. So multiple tools can actually be used to execute one technique, as probably most people already know. So but one of the more interesting ones is not all possible uses are there. So the only ones that are there are the ones that are publicly reported through all kinds of reports and processed by MITRE. So always assume that attack is incomplete. So this isn't the truth for your investigation, but it is at least a very nice focus point. And then from the other angle, it would also be interesting to see, okay, these techniques, if we want to focus on search util, for instance, who else is using these techniques? So I basically did an invert and did a query there to see, okay, who is actually looking at this. So the bear and the dukes are actually there, but also all kinds of dragons, pandas, kittens, criminals, the works. So if you look at the techniques that I highlighted, they're actually quite popular. And on the MITRE website, again, you see that search util is actually mentioned as a tool that can be used to download files given URL. So I figured let's at least write the detection for that one. So I started looking at the Microsoft website, and they have a lot of documentation there. So actually it's so much that it will take you quite some time to read, because the 34 minutes is ambitious if you want to understand everything. It's probably, for me at least, as a non-native speaker, it took me twice as long. So that's already an hour down well, not the drain, because I learned a lot about the tool, but there are there are plenty of other resources that you can utilize to have some more information about what's out there. So there is, of course, the LOLBAS project, as I mentioned. So this is a very small excerpt of it, where they describe multiple ways of executing a attack. So there's multiple ways. So they have a download way, they have alternative data stream, encode, decode. There's a lot of things that you can do with the tool, and they all show examples there. Then, of course, there is the Sigma project that has a lot of really useful open source detection rules that you can convert to any SIM or analytic platform that you like almost. I think they have, I stopped counting, but they have a lot of export methodologies, so it's relatively easy to convert it. And then there's, of course, also a very useful one on the opposite side is from the friends of the Red Canary, where they have the Atomic Red team that gives you all kinds of execution possibilities, how to replace some of these attacks. And I recently discovered the Strontiq Encyclopedia, which is my new and favorite resource here, because they provide so much about all kinds of executable binaries and even scripts that reside on typical operating systems. And they also provide it in a JSON and CSV format. So the website is one thing, but you can also ingest this into your SIM to do all kinds of interesting correlations. So there's a long list of data points that is available, but it might make more sense to just show you what it can do for at least search util. So there's 10 pages of this, and the biggest difference is, of course, the hashes, because the OS changes a little bit. So there's all the hashes that you want to have. There's the original file path, which is quite useful. Also, all of the standard output from the help, so all the command line options that they have. Some of the modules it will load, so the signature, which is there, the file metadata, including the original file name, which can be very useful, as we'll see later on. And a very long list of possible misuse. So Sigma is there, the LOLBAS, Atomic Red team, and a couple of other open source resources that are all gathered there. So it's almost your one-stop shop, even though it shouldn't be. But this will be a very friendly asset for you, at least. So start building a detection. I read through all the Sigma rules to the LOLBAS repository and the Atomic Red team, and there's a couple of ways that they describe actions. So I started noting down all the expected log sources that I would be seeing. And this is an expectation, of course, so this is the reality. But I figured, okay, if I use the standard event log, I'll see a process creation, I'll see a handle on a file, and I will see some network connections. And the same will go for Sysmon, of course. And it used to be called MS Defender ATP, but now it's something Defender for Endpoint. So I don't know the correct abbreviation yet, but at least the same event types are the same that I would expect from Sysmon or the security log. So depending on your log source, you always look at multiple ones if you have them. So I started just by simply playing with the tool, and this is what I often do. And this example, of course, is a very simple one, since search util is sort of versatile, but it's not a lot of work to research it. So I took one of the LOLBAS examples to download 7-zip, and I just flung it into PowerShell, and well, it worked, right? So it downloaded it. So then I wanted to learn a little bit about what is actually required to do this. Since there are a couple of command line parameters that are being used, what do they do? So the URL cache is the obvious one, where you point it to a URL and it will get the file that you pointed to. The -f that is being used is a force override, so I might not need that. And the same goes for the split, where it might evade some detection on an IDS, IPS, but maybe, or on a slow connection, but maybe it also doesn't really benefit me. So I could also play a little bit with that. And the rest of the ones are, benign. They don't contribute to the expected outcome. So I ignored them in this time. But there's more that you can do, right? So let's see what we can do. So if we replace the minus that was actually mentioned in the lolbas and also in the help with a slash, it still works. Okay, so that's a learned thing. And what if we change the order of the arguments? So if we put split and the /f before the URL cache, it also still works. So that's also something we might look into. And then if we remove everything and just do the URL cache, it still works as we might have expected. And it will give you a little bit more verbose output, but it works. So the effect is the same. And usually this is done in a hidden window anyway, so the user won't notice if it is a true attack. And we can go on, right? So what if we put the argument into double quotes? Still works. And then if we randomly sprinkle some double quotes through the argument, it also still works. So, and what if we write to an alternate data stream and we write it to 7-zip semicolon hidden? It's okay, that also works. You see an empty file, which might evade some detections. So yeah, let's deal with that. So there's some lessons that we learned now, right? So on the consideration part, the top URL is a possible way of utilizing it, and then the URL cache can also be slash. In older versions of search util, you could even do only the dash URL. HTTP can be anything, can also be HTTPS, SMB, or some variable that we actually pipe into it. The split is optional, /f is optional. It only forces an override, so if you do execute it once, you don't care. Well, you can do an alternate data stream. And one of the bigger important ones also is that search util can just be renamed by an attacker, and then you might be blind to everything that you wanted to see. So let's try to build a detection on the Defender for endpoint. And I start out with a very broad search. In 30 days, you'll probably catch something if it is in your environment, if you have the retention, of course. So I do two things here, and those will be a little bit more clear later on. So I have a time frame, which is basically the one for the whole detection, and then there's a hash time frame, which will be used right now, where I start looking at since Defender ATP doesn't, or Defender for endpoint doesn't have the original file name like Sysmon does, for instance. You can't just simply look for that to see whether somebody renamed it. So what I do here is I look for executions of search util and catch the hashes of that in a variable. And I do the same for all file events where the previous file name contains Sysmon search util, sorry. And I make a similar hash set. So I'll use that hash set later on over here, where I look for process creation events in the time frame that I set, and I look for either a SHA hash from one of those two gatherings I did, or just for the file name searchutil.exe, or where the process command line has searchutil. So I look for 4 different ways of executing the same binary, just to be able to make sure that I really catch it. And what I do next is I utilize a cool feature that is in the Custo query language, is where you can parse the command line to how the operating system would interpret it. So this is not the command line that you see in the logs, but this is the command line that actually gets processed. And therefore it will remove some of those ugly obfuscation characters or other weird things that you put into the command line, which is supremely useful there. And then I look within that sanitized command line for the decode, encode, verify, or URL words that are tied to that search util process. So in this way, I have a reasonable confidence that I would be able to catch it this way. And then I just basically order by whenever it happened, and I project what happened. And this is my detection rule for search util as I use it right now. There might still be ways to bypass it, but this at least has such a low false positive rate and still a high confidentiality of catching weird behavior with the tool that it might, for now I'm quite confident that they will work. So let's compare that without giving any beef to the creators of these Sigma rules, because I don't know what their intentions of developing that rule was, what the goal was, and also I've learned a lot over the last year playing with these tools that somebody didn't spend as much time as I did, maybe. So it's not I'm better than them thing. It's just to emphasize the point where you understand that once you get something from somebody else, always validate, make sure, and have a look at what they did versus what you know. So maybe you can improve it. So in this example, you do see that they only use the -f and the -n code. So that could be either the -f could be removed, and it doesn't account for renaming search util, and it could be bypassed in several ways by just replacing it with a slash, for instance. And in this example, this is already a little bit better, right? Where you see everything that looks for decode or various other commands. Some of them still have the search util in there, so that might still not be an issue. But at least it's a little bit more rigid. So the slash and the backslash or the slash and the dash are there. So you will get a lot. But also if it would be used on another command, you'll still catch it there. And the last one that I wanted to show is where they actually look at the commands, the original file name and the or the image. So it's an either or one where it will catch remain binaries. However, every execution of these binaries might pop up. So then you have to filter later on, which is still valuable. But yeah, just be aware of what you are covering and what you're missing, plus how you can filter those achievements. So we now looked at the detection I created. So there's still one left, which is fine for now. I assessed that risk was a little bit lower, and I created one rule to at least cover these two detections for search util. And on the detection spectrum that I mentioned before, it's relatively on the precise scale. It can probably be even more narrow, but then my false negative ratio starts popping up. And broader is noisier. So this was an okay place for me to have it. But again, so this is only one tool, right? So if we start looking at the ingress tool transfer, there's a lot of tools that can be used by a lot of attackers. So what you see is essentially the three techniques that can be executed from search util mapped to all the tools in MITRE again that are mentioned and also be used by several attackers or actor groups. So there's a lot of lessons that you can learn here. So these three techniques are actually used by 153 tools. So that's quite a lot to cover. And one tool can be executed to do either several techniques or all of them. Multiple use, again, can be used to execute one technique. And not all possible tools are mapped to, not even all of them are mapped. So again, only the ones that are publicly reported and processed by MITRE. So again, your assumption has to be that it is incomplete. And also what you should be thinking about is do I want to cover all those tools, or do I want to take a different approach and look for different means? So you might even ask the question, is detection the best way? And I rightfully agree. It's not only the only way. You also should prevent and or mitigate. And what I did here is I visualized the mitigations that are mentioned in MITRE, and bear in mind that these are quite new and on the heavy development. So there are a lot of things missing, but a few things stand out from my perspective, at least. That some are quite generic and might be hard to implement, where software configuration or even network intrusion prevention can be quite difficult, especially in a working from home situation as we are in now. And not all techniques are able to be covered with these mitigations, since out of the three, there are only two here. And there's multiple ways to achieve this. So again, it's always incomplete, but if you know ways like an app locker way or all kinds of other OS-based approaches to mitigate this. The host-based firewall might be useful. Please help the attack team also with these with submissions to help them improve the framework, since it is very, very popular and very useful still, even though it's incomplete. I mean, that's not a rant. It's just a good tool. But keep in mind that it is that. So another team at MITRE is helping a little bit out here as well. They recently published Shield, which is an active defense approach to detections, or to augment your detections. So it's primarily based on deception and mitigation, but there are some discovery activities in there as well. And what it would look like in a simple diagram is where your attack techniques do have some activities tied to it, or actions that you can take, which are mapped to active defense techniques. And these have sub-actions which are based in 3 categories, where you have some opportunities, you have use cases, and you have procedures that you can execute. So if we have to look at search util, you see that there are 2 active defense techniques that you can execute that actually are tied to multiple techniques, as you see above. So and this is not the best example, I have to admit, because PCAP collection is quite reactive or responsive. And API monitoring, if you don't have an EDR, it's quite difficult to achieve, but still very valuable. And if you have an EDR, definitely utilize these capabilities and build some custom detections on top of it, because most of it is still an open field. It's not as well covered as it should be. And in a slightly better example, I focused on the 3 most commonly seen attack techniques mentioned by Red Canary, where they mentioned that scheduled tasks, process injection, and credential dumping are at least the techniques that they encounter most. So if I do the same lookup where I want to address these 3 techniques, then there are 5 active defense techniques that you could execute on the middle part, and on the left you see all the techniques that are covered by those. So then you can have a sort of more visual impact of what actually would make sense for you to focus your efforts next to detection on. So maybe first do some security controls and augment that with some more system activity monitoring. So now you have a defensive part or detection part, but you should also focus on validating all your detections, as I mentioned in the beginning. So one of the ways to do this is, of course, red teaming, purple teaming, but these are relatively expensive and very time focused and have a smaller scope. So the preferred way to augment that is to have an adversary simulation tool that you can automate. There are multiple ones that I'll briefly highlight later on, but the big thing is that you can do this on a continuous basis, and it measures also your progress, but also your current status. So if you do this every week or every month, you at least know how well your defenses are doing. And therefore it's quite cost effective, because you don't have to have a large team, but it's definitely not a red team replacement or penetration testing. It also on a Skynet, hopefully. And it shouldn't be impacting your production environment. So it doesn't have to take anything down. It shouldn't break anything. It's a very valuable asset to have, just to see how well all your controls are doing. So there's a bunch of commercial ones. There's a couple of open source ones. It doesn't really matter which one you use, which one works for you, and it also depends a little bit on your maturity and the monetary resources that you have. So one of the things that you should do is select a tool, of course, to start with this, and fill that with a couple of things. So they usually have some stock content in there that you can utilize. You can record all the commands that you utilize during your detection engineering phase, which you can see on the screenshot. It's actually a lot longer, but then it wouldn't be readable anymore. I think I have 80 commands in there, and there's probably more ways to execute this. The Atomic Red Team, of course, is very useful and has a couple of pointers already and then Google is your best friend. But in the end, the most impactful thing is where you really start doing end-to-end validation. Once you have it in production, you actually also want to know whether your data pipeline is still working, whether your mitigative controls are still working, because somebody could just flick the button on a GPO and a lot of things might actually be broken from there on out. And you won't be able to see that from your SIM perspective if you don't get a sort of validation step in between. So as I mentioned, it should be in production, because even the best acceptance environment doesn't have the same realism as a true production environment, where an admin can just change anything. Users are doing all kinds of interesting things, and it's always lagging behind. So while lab and acceptance environments are very useful for developing it, don't use it for validation. So to wrap up, you should definitely layer your detections, but also your mitigations and your prevention efforts, and do your own research. Even though it looks like I did my homework, definitely try to prove me wrong on my stuff as well, because everybody makes mistakes, everybody has a bias, everybody has a bad day, or lacks the knowledge or creativity to utilize a tool in a new way again. The LOLBAS repository keeps on expanding, and all these other resources as well. So public information is really great as a starting point, but test their coverage, validate it, make sure that it's actually doing what you expect it to be doing, and also contribute back whenever you find something interesting. That's the hardest part, because usually you're too busy, but it will be a nice way to help the community that way as well. And don't forget about prevention and mitigation. Validate it and make sure that you don't trust the marketing of your own tools. So even Defender ATP, as an example that I used before, doesn't catch everything, and you can build your own custom rules, utilize a lot of the features they have with exploit guard and attack surface reduction and all the other ones, because they're not enabled out of the box, but they do make the difference between being exposed or actually catching this weird behavior. And lastly, attack. It's great for guidance. It's an awesome resource, but it's not a manual and definitely not a bingo sheet. So a lot of people are trying to cover it all. That's never possible. Just make the best decisions for your environment. And with that, I'm done. Thank you. I'll probably be on Discord for quite a while to hear how wrong I was, or for other questions that you might have. You can also reach out to me on Twitter or email or whatever you prefer.
So
thank you.
Olaf, I'm still with you. The first question I have for you is what time is it there?
Let's see. I think it's 10 to 10 p.m.
That's not bad.
It's dark behind me and outside, but it's okay.
We kind of figured. Hey, I appreciate it. That's awesome presentation, sir. I did reach out in Discord and say if anybody had questions. So they've got 30 seconds to reply back and say they've got amazing amounts of questions. Who said bingo? I don't know. Are you following Discord? I know you're in Discord all the time. You're in Discord with us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hit it now because I otherwise get distracted during the presentation, but I'll be there.
That is a thing. When Jordan and I co-present, he'll be talking and I'll get into Discord, and I cannot. He'll ask me a question, I'll be like, I was reading Discord. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's the downside of it. But it's if you're co-presenting, it can be useful sometimes. Then you can address something right during the presentation. It's nice.
Yeah, as one person though, it'd be so tough to look over and then you want to answer the question right away, and man, it's tough.
Yeah.
How much time?
I have a hard time keeping track of my slides. So if I augment it with more input, then no, it's a bad idea.
No problem. Hey, one question here that I think is a question. All right, approximately how much time does DE cycle take for sub-technique? How much of this is typically an individual effort versus team of people?
Well, yeah, if you have a team, that definitely make it a team effort, because there's multiple ways of looking at things. I work with my red team colleagues on a daily basis. And we even do a lot of purple and sometimes content development efforts together, where it's super useful to have multiple people looking at least the research part of it and playing with all the base query or the base ways of executing it. And then building a detection can be a one-person thing where you can have a second set of eyes at it once it gets to a certain stage. Because it's so much more efficient, and this is why it's very important to document all the research that you do, so that somebody can have a look at it and say, okay, hey, this is interesting. I didn't know that, but did you know that you can actually do this, and that? Where immediately within a couple of minutes you are already more resilient than you were before. So definitely make it a team effort if you do have the resources for that.
Amazing, awesome. Of course. Jordan wanted me to ask and leverage the opportunity with you to say, hey, when are you updating the Sysmon schema to support event ID 24 for clipboards?
I think I got a pull request yesterday. So
amazing.
I was focusing on this presentation. Afterwards, I have a little bit more time, so I'll definitely do that shortly.
Hey, fantastic, sir. Thank you for coming out with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Awesome. Hey, sir, you have a great afternoon. Or evening.
Same to you. Well,
sleepy time.
Evening for me. No, it's not sleepy time yet. And there's so much cool content that you guys are having, so I have to stay up.